So this one's going to be the third talk that I'm doing on the power of telling Yeshua's stories, the stories from God's word, word of mouth, orally. And I wanted to share with you guys something that really impacted me this last week, actually. I encountered a book here. It's called Shall We Tell the President by Jeffrey Archer. And second to the Bible, this is probably the best book I've ever read. Like, it totally floored me. The main character, Jeffrey, like, it just, I learned so much from this book. It has some pretty stunning little recommendations too. Like Vogue says, here is terror, outrageous and top-notch. Cosmopolitan says, authentic, literate, and scary. What are some other good ones in here? Washington Post is a storyteller in the class and style of Alexander Dumas. So this book impacted me so much. It changed my life so much that I actually want you guys to read it this week. I want you to read it so that we can talk about it and learn it. So I'm going to begin sharing some of this book with you guys so that you can learn it. And I think it's going to change your life too. So here's some of the book for you guys here. And I'd like you to just read that. And we'll read some of this story today, and we'll discuss it. And then I'll give you some more chunks and snippets in the next couple years, every Saturday. Here, was that not enough pieces? Here, I'll get you guys some more pieces just to make sure you get the storyline here. So here's, no problem. So there you go.
Thank you.
No problem. So yeah. So anyway, I really think that you guys are going to be excited about this. This is gonna change your life just like it changed my life. So if you guys wouldn't mind, maybe can you just look at those little chunks for a bit and just tell me the story and maybe tell me what happened and why this story changed my life and inspired me so much. If you want, I can give you some more pages. Here's some more. Some for you, some for you, and some for you. Yeah, so.
Fellow named Mark, and then sign.
Oh man. I just have to tell you, my friend Yvonne, some of you probably know her. She was in her Hebrew classes. I called her up because she lives close to us and because she loves books just like I do. And I was like, Yvonne, I need a novel that I can tear apart. Do you have any? She's like, yeah, come over. So we walked over to her house today and she had two. And there was this one. You can tell this is a very expensive and high quality book. And then she had another one that actually looked kind of nice. And I was like, I hate tearing books up. Books are like my babies, right? So I took the cheap one. So anyway, what do you think you would call it, what I just did to you guys? Destruction. Confusion. Giving you part of the story? Okay.
You told us to do something that we can't do with this information.
Told you to do something that you can't do?
But it would make the community stronger because we try to piece everything together and share, and we would work.
Good luck. Yeah, it would make the community stronger, hey? Because you'd have to piece it together and share. Basically, this is what I'm doing. I'm taking that novel, which is a story from beginning to end, and I'm taking it out of context, and then I'm expecting you guys to get it. I'm expecting you guys to be impacted the same way that I was when I read the story from beginning to end. And here's the thing, just like that novel is a story from beginning to end, and you could say it's coherent. Would that make sense if I use the word coherent? Like it's all stuck together, it's all connected. Each of these figures, they have a past. Every conversation in that story, it has a setting, that kind of idea. It's a coherent story. That's true of the scriptures also. Here's some interesting things. Like when you look at the scriptures, here I have the copy that I usually read from. This book is a story. From Genesis to Revelation, it's a story. You could say it's one big story composed of many littler stories, maybe sometimes like a TV series or something like that. It goes on for several years and the story builds, that kind of thing, eh? That's like what this is. Or some of those historical novels that you read where it actually builds from generation to generation, some of those longer ones. I had a buddy that I lived with in Winnipeg that was really into those kinds of historical novels, eh? And basically that's what this book is, except that it is a true story. It's a historical narrative. And like I said, it's one big story, and it's also a string of stories set together. If you actually take this and you ask yourself, how much of this is actually narrative? Like how much of this is stories? Over 50% is stories. So over 50% of this book is just narrative and stories. And then there are some other like, you could say genres of literature in there also. What would be some of the other genres of literature? Poetry, yep. Mystery. Autobiography, okay. Prophecy would be another one. Yeah, two of the bigger ones aside from narrative or story is poetry and prophecy. And but that's left in, yep, teaching and instruction. That's good. There's lots of that in there. There's teaching, instruction, there are laws. So, but isn't that interesting that when you look at these different genres like poetry, prophecy, practical instruction, all of those make up for actually less than half of what this book contains. Wow, that's what this, it's incredible to think, what if there's a creator out there? And what if he wants to somehow contact the human race and communicate with us? What would he say? How would he do it? If he could just somehow, just like beam something through to us, would you believe it that he beamed a book through to us that's like over half of it is stories? That's interesting to me. That's interesting that that's how he'd communicate with us human beings, that's how he'd want to make contact with us. Even the elements that aren't story, let's say the poetic sections, like some of the poetic prayers in the book of Tehillim, Psalms, if you read one of those, every one of those has a story behind it, because every one of those was written by somebody who was going through a real life experience. Like for instance, the Psalms of David. When you just read those and you don't know anything about David, I mean, yeah, they're pretty meaningful and you can make some of it your own. But when you realize this guy was on the run, he was a fugitive because his father-in-law hated him and was trying to kill him. Some of those prayers all of a sudden become more meaningful. Or this is the prayer that David prayed when his son led a national rebellion against him. And everybody backstabbed him. The whole country backstabbed him after he worked so hard for him. All of a sudden that prayer becomes more meaningful because you know the story behind it. Or some of the prophets. You think about the prophet Jeremiah. If you just read those prophecies, it's like, I don't know, a bunch of stuff about Israel and Judah and the Babylonians, and you read these prophecies and I don't know, like seriously, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you read it knowing the story, that the northern tribes had already been like decimated by the Assyrians and they were gone for 150 years, and that there were only a couple tribes that were just clinging to survival in the south because they had been faithful to God, and that the Babylonians were looming on the horizon, and that there was this threat of them coming and wiping out the country. If you could imagine radical Islam today and a threat of wiping out Israel, radical Babylon wiping out Israel. There was a story there, and that's the story into which Jeremiah stepped, and that was the story in which Jeremiah prophesied, and Yahweh said things to his people through him, right? So can you hear, even with prophecy, the setting is a story. Even with poetry, the setting is a story. Real people, real life experiences, that kind of thing. Here is something else that's interesting. You know how I've been talking about the concept of word of mouth? When something isn't written down, but you hear it, maybe someone else tells you, you see it on the news, you hear it on the radio, or maybe it's that kind of idea. That's called word of mouth or oral learning, oral communication, right? When you look at a lot of this book, it was originally not written down. It was originally communicated orally, and that includes things like the Psalms. David was out in the desert, and he composed this prayer. My guess is he wasn't sitting there with his little moleskin notebook, like composing beautiful poetry. I mean, this guy was on the run. His life was being threatened. He probably just composed it and then and put it to music so he wouldn't forget it. And then maybe later he wrote it down. Maybe 10 years or 20 years later, when he actually got settled down and he had a kingdom and he had some time to write some books. You know, that kind of thing. So just think about the Psalms like that. That's true, some of the Psalms are very long. But if you set things to music, have you ever noticed how much easier it is to remember them, eh? Yeah. So it wasn't just a poetic poem, it was a song, and then it sticks in your head. Yeah, totally. Okay, do you guys want to know why? Because the two hemispheres of your brain, they synchronize when you hear a song. Because you hear lyrics, which engages one half of your brain, and you hear music, which engages the other half of your brain. So that's a little freebie that I'll just throw in for you. That's totally, doesn't really, yeah, anyway, there you go. Or here's another example, the prophets. They would go and they would say, this is what Yahweh is saying, and they'd stand in the temple and they just shout it to all the people, probably over and over and over again throughout the course of a day, so everybody heard it. So you just start to think about that. Or like I mentioned, the Torah or the Gospels. Much of that was communicated word of mouth. It was communicated orally, sometimes for decades, centuries, for like a bunch of generations before it was written down, hey? So I love the Word of God. I so love the Scriptures, and so it's really cool to think about, how did we get this stuff? How was it originally told? You know, trying to get in the mindset of the people who originally heard it. And I don't know, maybe we can get a certain vibe back that maybe we lost when we just think of this as a book that you read in a monotone voice. You know what I mean? So that's something to think about. Here's what I would see maybe as being a problem, whether we be like in a church or a Messianic synagogue or whatever. Sometimes we as believers, we skip the stories. We leave out all the juicy details, and we just say, remember that, and then we kind of make our point. See, and you know what, that works if everybody in the room knows the stories, if they're all like literate types, eh? But we're a family of disciples, and we want to see a bunch of baby disciples. We want to see Yeshua giving us baby disciples. We want to teach new believers, right? And here's the problem. If we just reference, remember this story, and then we make our point, but we don't actually tell the story, you lose all those new people. And you make them feel like outsiders because they don't know the story. They're like, oh man, these people have been believers for 10 or 20 or 30 years, and they've read the Bible so many times, and I just don't. And then all of a sudden you feel like you're the outsider, eh? So I just think that's something to be aware of. Whether it be me as a teacher talking, whether it be us when we're midrashing, just talking about the Scriptures, whether it be any pastor preaching in his church. Make sure you tell the story. Don't kind of like just reference this story and skip all the juicy details just to make your point in your sermon. All right, Pastor? All right, Pastor? Well, you guys aren't pastors, but that's kind of the idea that I get out of that. So let's just as an action point, let's make sure we tell the stories and soup it up, do a good job telling them, right? Because that's how they were originally communicated, and don't assume that everybody knows them already. So that's an action point for you. I have a quote here from a man named John Locke, philosopher. Wouldn't recommend you really get into John Locke. He lived several centuries ago. But this is an interesting thought from him. Have you noticed that in your Bible, if you have a Bible, just open it up and have a look at it, you'll probably have lots and lots of little numbers. And some of them are at the beginning of a chunk, and then some of them are at the beginning of a sentence or paragraph. Right? You have the whole Bible broken up into chapters and verses. And that's really good. That's like our GPS system so that we know where to go and how to be on the same page and stuff, right? But here's the interesting thing. For a really, really long time, those chapters and verses weren't in the Scriptures. For example, when Paul wrote one of his letters, he didn't write it with chapter and verse. He just wrote the thing in one big schlock. That'd be a word like just boom, just put it out there, right? Or when the stories in the book of Genesis were written down, they weren't written down as chapter and verse. And someone came along in the last couple thousand years, and they inserted the chapters and then they inserted the verses, and that's good. But sometimes it makes us do weird things with the Bible. It makes us start to, actually, I'll just read this quote from John Locke because I think he says it very well. He says, "The Scriptures are chopped and minced, and, as they are now printed, stand so broken and divided that not only the common people take the verses, usually, for distinct aphorisms," which is like a principle or a rule or something. Everyone say aphorism. "But even men of more advanced knowledge, in reading them, lose very much of the strength and force of the coherence and the light that depends on it." I'll read that again, just because it's really, he says that really well. "The Scriptures are chopped and minced, and, as they are now printed, stand so broken and divided that not only the common people take the verses usually for distinct aphorisms, but even men of more advanced knowledge in reading them lose very much of the strength and force of the coherence and the light that depends on it. So, okay, I'm sure we've all been to church services where, you have the singing time, and the kids are usually in for that part, and then before the sermon starts, the kids are usually called to the front, and someone gives kind of a mini sermon. They tell a story, or maybe they use an object lesson or something like that. I love that. I love that part personally. Lois, I think you do that quite often, from my understanding, and it sounds like you do a really good job of it, and that's often what you do. You tell a story, or you use an object lesson. Here's an interesting little thing to consider. Which do most people pay closer attention to? To the little children's blurb or to the sermon? If you were to poll people at the door and say, what was the main point of the sermon, what can you remember, and then poll them and say, what was the main point of the kids blurb and what can you remember, I would probably be embarrassed to say I probably remember the kids stuff better. I don't know, have any of you guys experienced that ever? That's why we don't have a kids blurb here, because I would be embarrassed, because you'd remember the kids blurb and you wouldn't remember what I say. No, just joking.
Just be the kids blurb.
Yeah. I will be the kids blurb. Okay, but let me ask you, why is that? Why do people remember the kids blurb better than the sermon?
I think because it's similar to a parable. Whether it's an object lesson, an item right there, or someone's bringing a story in their own experience, and then they're teaching a truth by either a visual aid or a story, or So there's that connection made.
So they're using visual aids, and what was the other thing? Yeah, they're telling stories, right? Often from their own experiences, or that kids can relate to.
And they tell usually a whole story, right? Or they just tell the story and make it dynamic instead of, it's simple.
Yeah, that's exactly. The three things I thought of were, it's short, because we usually have short attention spans as human beings, including me. Simple language is used. They don't use words like aphorisms. And it's a story, it's coherent. Everything is kind of one nice little package, eh? Easy to remember, yeah. I'm going to read you guys a couple pages from a book, and we're going to learn some things from Sesame Street. Would that be okay? Because Sesame Street is really smart. I learned a lot of things from Sesame Street growing up, like how to share, and what the letter Q says. Quentin had a quota, he kept it on a string, and every time he tossed it, the quota would start to sing. Quack, 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 quack. I remember all this stuff from Sesame Street, right? And so and it's not a mistake that Sesame Street was so successful in engaging kids. I'll just read you guys a couple pages. This is a book called The Tipping Point by a really smart guy named Malcolm Gladwell. In this book, he studies all of these social movements and things that go viral, even literal viruses. And very often something will kind of be plugging along, and all of a sudden it'll just go boom, and it'll go big. Maybe it's even a brand of shoes, or a sickness, like I mentioned, or some social movement. And so he studies these in this book, and he says, what is that tipping point that all of a sudden makes something go viral? And I really find things like this fascinating, because I want Yeshua to go viral. I want the whole following Yeshua thing to go big, in NPA. And so I think about this stuff. So I'm going to read you a little section here. He says, Sesame Street is best known for the creative geniuses it attracted. People like Jim Henson and Joe Raposo and Frank Oz, who intuitively grasped what it takes to get through to children. They were television's answer to Beatrix Potter or L. Frank Baum. Does anyone know who L. Frank Baum was? That was before my time. I'm a Sesame Street kid. Anyway, or Dr. Seuss. But it is a mistake to think of Sesame Street as a project conceived in a flash of insight. What made the show unusual, in fact, was the extent to which it was exactly the opposite of that. The extent to which the final product was deliberately and painstakingly engineered. Sesame Street was built around a single breakthrough insight that if you can hold the attention of children, you can educate them. This may seem obvious, but it isn't. Many critics of television to this day argue that what's dangerous about TV is that it is addictive, that children and even adults watch it like zombies. According to this view, it's the formal features of television, Violence, bright lights, loud and funny noises, quick editing cuts, zooming in and out, exaggerated action, and all the other things we associate with commercial TV that hold our attention. In other words, we don't have to understand what we're looking at or absorb what we're seeing in order to keep watching. That's what many people mean when they say that television is passive. We watch when we're stimulated by all the whizzes and bangs of the medium, and we look away or turn the channel when we're bored. What the pioneering television researchers of the 1960s and 1970s, in particular Daniel Anderson at the University of Massachusetts, began to realize, however, is that this isn't how preschoolers watch TV at all. Hey, you spend a lot of time with preschoolers. You'll have to tell us at the end of this is true, Sheree. Quote, "The idea was that kids would sit, stare at the screen, and zone out," said Elizabeth Lorch, a psychologist at Amherst College. But once we began to look carefully at what children were doing, we found out that short looks were actually more common. There was much more variation. Children didn't just sit and stare. They could divide their attention between a couple of different activities, and they weren't being random. There were predictable influences on what made them look back at the screen, and these were not trivial things, not just flash and dash. Lorch, for instance, once re-edited an episode of Sesame Street so that certain key scenes of some of the sketches were out of order. If kids were only interested in flash and dash, that shouldn't have made a difference. The show, after all, still had songs and Muppets and bright colors and action and all the things that make Sesame Street so wonderful. But it did make a difference. The kids stopped watching. If they couldn't make sense of what they were looking at, they weren't going to look at it. In another experiment, Lorch and Dan Anderson showed two groups of 5-year-olds an episode of Sesame Street. Two groups. The kids in the second group, however, were put in a room with lots of very attractive toys on the floor. As you would expect, the kids in the room without the toys watched the show about 87% of the time, while the kids with the toys watched only about 47% of the time. Kids are distracted by toys. But when they tested the two groups to see how much of the show the children remembered and understood, the scores were exactly the same. This result stunned the two researchers. Kids, they realized, were a great deal more sophisticated in the way they watched than had been imagined. So did you guys catch that? I just want to go over that because that's kind of the key study there. So they had two groups of kids in two rooms. One of them had attractive toys, one had no toys. The group with the attractive toys watched how much of the time?
87%?
No, with the toys, 47. And the kids without the toys watched how much of the time? 87%, yeah, right. Okay, and then when they asked them some questions to see how much they caught or were watching, what did they discover? Yeah, the scores were exactly the same. That floored me, quite frankly, to hear that. Because with that, okay, just on the side note, what that told me about my daughter is even when I don't think she's watching, she's watching. And even when I don't think she's learning, like right now, she actually is. And guess what? Yeah, and guess what? We're all like that. So if you're in a room and some guy's sitting there like playing on his phone or fiddling, he's still learning. In fact, he might be catching more than you. So that because you're busy being distracted by him. So there's a thought for you. Anyway, quote, "We were led to the conclusion," they wrote, "that the 5-year-olds in the toys group were attending quite strategically, distributing their attention between toy play and viewing so that they looked at what, for them, were the most informative parts of the program. This strategy was so effective that the children could gain no more from increased attention." Isn't that crazy? They could have been like, "Put that toy down, kid. I want you to keep your eyes on that screen the whole time so you'll learn." And they wouldn't have learned anything more. They wouldn't have, all the increased attention wouldn't have helped. So he finishes his thought here. If you take these two studies together, the toy study and the editing study, you reach quite a radical conclusion about children and television. Kids don't watch when they're stimulated and look away when they're bored. They watch when they understand and look away when they're confused. So it's not about entertaining people and getting all the flash and dash, to use his phrase, that will keep their attention. It's talking on a level that they understand. And that applies whether you're in a one-on-one conversation, whether you're midrashing over the scriptures in a group, whether you're a pastor preaching. It's not the entertainment that's going to engage people. It's when they understand what you're talking about. So that's some wisdom from Sesame Street for us along those lines. Here's Here's the last thing for you that'll hopefully kind of get you thinking about this. In 2007, on March 14th, a lady named Kathy Lynn Grossman published a report in USA Today. It was entitled, "Americans Get an F in Religion." And here are two statistics from that report. You can look up the rest of it online if you want. 60% of Americans, and that probably means North Americans in general, can't list 5 of the 10 commandments. Right? So if we had those little blue people kind of lined up here today, you have 10 little blue people, and that represent everyone in North America. 5 of those won't be able to list, 6 of those won't be able to list 5 of the 10 commandments. That's the first statistic for you. Second statistic, 50% of high school seniors thought Sodom and Gomorrah were married. Yeah, that's crazy though. That, like, if you were to, let's say, go to Carleton and you got those same statistics, half of those kids would think Sodom and Gomorrah were married. It's like, that's the level of like unfamiliarity that people have with the Word of God, with the history of Israel, with the whole Bible. And, maybe, it'd be easy to quote the statistics and just be like, oh, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Oh, we're becoming so secularized. Oh, we better just build our bunkers and hunker down and just wait for Jesus to come back and get us out of this pagan culture. People can react like that, and sometimes people do, but I don't think that's the right response. I think it's just one of those things where we say, okay, this is the world we live in. We don't always have to send our missionaries halfway around the world to reach pagan cultures, because you have a pagan culture down the street. Maybe you're a missionary right now. Maybe we need to begin thinking like missionaries here, just like missionaries train to go around the world. They learn a new language. They dress like the people they're trying to reach. They think about, how can I relate the good news of Yeshua to these people on a level that they'll get and speak their language? And guess what? Missionaries do that halfway around the world, but we often don't do that here in North America. So anyway, that's just a little side blurb for the fact that we are on mission here in PA, just as much as your parents were on mission in the Philippines, whenever that was. So what I would say, like, when you kind of connect the dots here, when you look at this study, people listen when they understand, and when they don't get it, their attention goes elsewhere. When you connect the dots with that and these statistics about how people just don't know the Word of God, what I would suspect is that it's not so much that people have rejected biblical values and truth. I think it's just that they haven't understood them. I think it's just that they have never heard them in a way that makes sense, that people have never told them like in a coherent way. Coherent is when things are all, they're connected. It's like a story and it makes sense. Incoherent is when it's like verse over here, verse over there, someone alludes to a story, and I just don't have a clue what's going on. This is way over my head, and then I lose my attention, and let's see what's going on Facebook. Right? And frankly, I think that's that's happened to our generation. So, I don't know, like I would say probably just one action point, this is my main point from these statistics and from some of these things that we're thinking about, is just let's make sure that we talk on a level that anybody can understand, and let's realize that the scriptures are a story, that the scriptures are a series of stories, and let's learn to tell those stories. Reading them is good, but let's learn to always also tell those stories word of mouth, in language that anybody will be able to understand. That is a journey that I'm on right now, and I've been having a lot of fun with it, quite frankly, and hopefully that's a journey that we as a community are on, and I invite each of you as individuals to go on that journey also. It might take some changing, it might take some learning, it might be a little uncomfortable, because learning new things is always uncomfortable, and it's always challenging, but hey, we're a group, and maybe we can figure out how to do that together. And I'm not saying, let's not read the Bible. I'm not saying, let's not do what we're doing, but I'm saying, let's be asking these questions and be sensitive to this. Actually, I will say one thing. If you often look at how a Bible study or a sermon is done in a traditional church setting, very often you kind of have that Frankenstein thing where you kind of chop a verse here, take another bit here, and then you all kind of piece it together and you get this Frankenstein thing that just is kind of scary and not very inviting, sometimes you have it. Often, we can have that in the Messianic world too. But I think something that's really good that I'm encouraged by is very often people, like Messianic kind of people, they don't just snip a verse here and take a verse there. They say, let's read together. And so they get together in a group and they just read a chapter, or they read several chapters in a row. And guess what? That's coherent. And very often that's a story. And even who's someone who isn't who is more non-literate, who wouldn't read a book on their own, when you sit in a group, someone else is reading and you can just sit there and hear it. And that's the way half of the people in our culture learn. So anyway, I just want to see a huge thumbs up because I think that's something we're doing really right in the Messianic community, and I hope that we continue to grow in that. Thank you for joining us in this message. I pray that it's been an inspiration to you in your discipleship to Yeshua the Messiah. Crown of Messiah is a relatively small congregation with a massive mission. We're not just making disciples and teaching the Word of God here in our city. We're also doing that internationally through vehicles such as the internet. It is our joy to offer you these messages for free at absolutely no charge. At the same time, we do have ongoing overhead expenses. It costs us something to produce these teachings and get them out to you. And we would appreciate it if you would, in turn, support our work in a practical way. Help us cover some of our basic expenses. You can do that by going to our website, crownofmessiah.com, and going to the donate page, where you can make a one-time donation or you can set up a monthly automated donation. I'm reminded of the words of Yeshua's apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 6. He said, "Let the one who is taught the word share everything good with his teacher." So if you're being taught the word by us, we would appreciate it if you would take the words of Yeshua's apostle seriously and make some type of return for the blessing that we are giving you for free. That way, we'll all be in it together, and we will be a team accomplishing the mission that Yeshua has given us. And you will go from only being a receiver to also being a giver. If you're like most people, finances are tight. We understand that. Finances are tight for us too. That's why we need people like you to come alongside us and to back us in the work that Yeshua has called us to do. Thank you so much for making that donation at crownofmessiah.com, and thank you for becoming a team member with us. We appreciate it.